We've all seen these pictures, right? These incredible figures moving with their herds across these vast open landscapes. They're nomadic pastoralists. And their story isn't just some footnote in a history book. It's a massive, often forgotten part of our world's story. So let's dig in and figure out why.
Just let that sink in for a second. This quote really gets to the heart of the problem. For centuries, you have entire civilizations that thrived on the move, and yet we've treated them like they're just relics, like their lives don't really matter. Well, in this explainer, we're going to challenge that idea head-on and see how their story is, unbelievably, more relevant now than ever.
Okay, first things first, let's be super clear about what we mean by nomads. We're not just talking about aimless wanderers. A better way to think of them is as seasonal specialists. Their entire existence is built on strategic movement, a constant, really smart search for fresh pastures and water.
All right, so here's the journey we're going to take together. First, we'll get into the brilliant logic of this mobile life. Then, we'll see it in action in the mountains and deserts of India. After that, we'll witness the massive collision with colonial rule and see that story echoed all the way in Africa with the Maasai. Finally, we'll look at their incredible resilience and ask a pretty surprising question. Are nomads actually the future?
So, let's start with the logic behind it all. Again, this is not just random wandering. It is a highly sophisticated system, one that's built on this deep, almost intuitive knowledge of the environment around them.
Pastoralism is basically an ingenious solution to a really tough problem. How do you survive? How do you thrive in places where farming is pretty much impossible, like in arid deserts or way up in high mountains? The answer is, you don't fight the environment, you move with it. It's this incredibly careful calculation of seasons and resources, a rhythm that has sustained millions of people for generations.
And there is probably no better place to see this beautiful rhythm than in India. Before colonial times, the subcontinent was just alive with the movement of countless pastoral groups, and each one had its own unique, incredible cycle. Just look at this. This map shows you just how widespread this way of life was, from the Gujar Bakr walls navigating the Himalayas, all the way to the Raikas in the deserts of Rajasthan. Every single group had its own rhythm. This wasn't some fringe lifestyle. It was woven into the very fabric of the entire subcontinent.
Let's just zoom in on the Gaudy shepherds for a second, because their annual journey is a perfect example of this logic. In the winter, they're down in the low hills, but by April, they start marching north, up to the high mountain meadows for the summer, following the grass and avoiding the worst of the weather. It's this precise, cyclical migration, year in and year out.
And this right here is a really key insight. This was not an isolated lifestyle. Pastoralists and settled farmers had this vital, mutually beneficial relationship. The nomads' flocks would come down and graze on the harvested fields, and in return, their animals would manure the soil, making it perfectly fertile for the next crop. It was a perfect self-renewing system.
But this ancient, balanced rhythm was about to be completely shattered. The arrival of British colonial rule brought a totally different worldview, one that saw this incredible, mobile way of life not as an asset, but as a problem that needed to be solved.
So you gotta ask, why the suspicion? Well, it really all came down to one thing: control. The colonial government wanted to rule over a settled population. See, people who live in fixed villages are easy to identify, they're easy to count, and most importantly, they are easy to tax. Nomads, who are always on the move, they just didn't fit that model. They were seen as unpredictable, ungovernable, and because of that, dangerous.
And this slide shows exactly how they systematically took apart the pastoral economy. First, they squeezed the land. The wasteland rules turned common pastures into taxable private farms, and the Forest Acts closed off huge vital grazing areas. Then, they targeted the people themselves. The infamous Criminal Tribes Act of 1871 literally branded entire communities as criminal just for being mobile. And finally, they hit their livelihood directly by slapping a tax on every single animal they owned.
Now what's crazy is that this story of collision wasn't just happening in India. Let's shift continents to Africa, where we see a powerful global echo of this exact same process. All across the world, colonialism had a similar and just as devastating impact on pastoral communities. I mean, we're talking about a way of life that over 22 million Africans still depend on today. To really understand the story, we're going to focus on one of the most well-known communities, the Maasai of East Africa.
Their experience is an incredibly powerful parallel to what we just saw happening in India.
Just look at this timeline. It shows a swift and almost total loss. Before 1885, Mosaland was this vast, open territory. But then European powers came in and literally drew a line on a map, cutting it in two. Their best grazing lands were seized for white settlers, and then huge areas were turned into game reserves, making them completely off-limits to the Maasai and their herds.
And this is the result: 60%. The Maasai lost about 60% of their pre-colonial lands. They were pushed into this small, arid zone with unpredictable rain and poor pastures, which just created immense pressure on the little land that was left.
So with their lands gone and their movements restricted, how on earth did these communities survive? Well, this is where the story shifts from one of loss to one of just incredible resilience and adaptation. This comparison really puts it in black and white, doesn't it? On one side, you have freedom of movement, access to all the best seasonal resources. On the other, you have confinement. They were pushed to the absolute margins, forced onto the least fertile lands, and they had to completely reinvent their way of life just to survive.
And their responses were incredibly resourceful. Some adapted their herding, they reduced their flocks, or found entirely new migration routes. Others had to change their livelihood completely. Some of the richer pastoralists bought land and settled down, while the poorer ones were often forced to become laborers. And crucially, through all of this, they began to organize and fight for their political rights.
All of this pressure from the outside also started to fracture the communities from within. In Maasai society, for example, the British appointed chiefs, which totally disrupted the traditional authority of the elders and the warriors. And this created a brand new divide, one that wasn't based on age and experience anymore, but on colonial-backed wealth, pitting powerful chiefs against poor herders.
So this brings us to our final question. We started this whole thing with the idea of pastoralists being figures from the past, but is that really the case? What if we've got it all wrong?
And this is where the entire story just flips on its head. Far from being some outdated relic, a lot of ecologists now argue that in these really harsh environments, mobile pastoralism is actually the most sustainable form of life. See, that constant movement allows pastures to recover. It prevents the desertification that often comes from trying to overexploit these fragile lands. And so we're left with this question. The story of the pastoralists is this powerful reminder that what modern society often dismissed as primitive actually contains some profound ecological wisdom. So the question for us is,